The hearing had already taken on the tone of a quiet execution. Every word spoken by my wife's attorney felt like another nail being driven into the version of my life I was desperately trying to protect. I sat at the wooden table, hands clasped tightly together, listening as my failures were carefully arranged into a convincing narrative. On paper, it looked airtight. Missed school pickups were framed as neglect, long work hours as emotional abandonment, and every disagreement we'd ever had was transformed into proof that I was unfit to be a stable parent. I could feel the judge's attention drifting away from me with each passing minute, drawn instead toward the polished certainty of the opposing counsel. My own lawyer leaned over and whispered reassurances, but they felt hollow. We both knew how this was going. The evidence stacked against me wasn't entirely fabricated, but it was brutally stripped of context. There was no space in the courtroom for exhaustion, sacrifice, or the quiet compromises made by a parent trying to keep a family afloat. All that mattered were dates, times, and carefully chosen words that made me look absent, unreliable, and indifferent. I could almost see the outcome forming in the judge's mind, a decision that would reduce my role in my daughter's life to scheduled weekends and supervised visits. As the questioning continued, I felt smaller with every answer I gave. My voice sounded weak even to my own ears, as though the room itself was swallowing my words before they could carry any weight. I glanced once toward my daughter, seated behind me with her feet not quite touching the floor. She looked calm, far calmer than I felt, her hands folded neatly in her lap. That calm scared me. Children were supposed to be frightened in places like this, not quietly observant. I wondered how much she understood, how much of this burden she was silently carrying. The judge's expression hardened as the final statements were delivered. It was the look of someone who believed they had already seen enough. I braced myself for the ruling, mentally preparing for the moment when my life would be divided into before and after. I thought about the mornings I'd packed lunches half asleep, the nights I'd stayed up helping with homework, the promises I'd made to always be there. None of that had made it into the record. None of it seemed to matter. By the time the judge announced a brief recess before making a decision, I knew I was losing. Not just the case, but the story of who I was as a father. I sat there, defeated, staring at the polished floor, feeling the weight of inevitability press down on my chest. I had walked into the courtroom believing the truth would be enough. Sitting there in silence, I realized how wrong I had been. The longer the hearing went on, the clearer it became that the courtroom was not a place where truth naturally rose to the surface. It was a stage, and the story being told there had been rehearsed long before I ever took my seat. My wife's attorney spoke with calm precision, weaving together half-truths and omissions into something that sounded complete and undeniable. Every exhibit presented was technically real, yet carefully framed to suggest a reality that felt foreign to the life I had actually lived. Context was stripped away, replaced by insinuation and strategic pauses that let the judge's imagination do the rest. I listened as text messages were read aloud, their tone twisted by selective emphasis. A rushed reply sent between meetings was portrayed as cold indifference. A frustrated message written late at night after weeks of unresolved tension was presented as evidence of instability. Dates were highlighted, but the circumstances behind them were conveniently ignored. It was unsettling to hear fragments of my own words used against me, reshaped into weapons that cut far deeper than I expected. I wanted to interrupt, to explain, to tell the full story, but the structure of the hearing allowed no room for that kind of honesty. What made it worse was how convincing it all sounded. Even I began to question myself. Maybe I should have done more. Maybe I should have fought harder earlier, spoken up sooner, been less trusting. The narrative painted me as a distant figure in my daughter's life, someone who showed up only when it was convenient. That image clashed violently with my memories, yet in the sterile atmosphere of the courtroom, memories carried no weight unless they were documented, time-stamped, and filtered through legal language.
What made it worse was how convincing it all sounded. Even I began to question myself. Maybe I should have done more. Maybe I should have fought harder earlier, spoken up sooner, been less trusting. The narrative painted me as a distant figure in my daughter's life, someone who showed up only when it was convenient. That image clashed violently with my memories. Yet in the sterile atmosphere of the courtroom, memories carried no weight unless they were documented, time-stamped, and filtered through legal language. My wife sat across the room, her expression carefully composed. When she spoke, her voice wavered at just the right moments, trembling with rehearsed vulnerability. Tears appeared on cue, each one reinforcing the picture of her as the stable, selfless parent forced to compensate for my shortcomings. I recognized the performance for what it was, but recognition didn't matter. The judge wasn't there to decode emotions, he was there to assess credibility. And credibility, it seemed, favored the person who told the smoother story. As witnesses were called, the imbalance became even more pronounced. Friends and relatives repeated versions of events they had only partially witnessed, their testimonies aligning neatly with the narrative already in motion. No one mentioned the nights I rushed home despite exhaustion, or the weekends I canceled work to be present. Those moments didn't fit the story, so they were excluded. The truth wasn't outright denied, it was simply crowded out. By the time the arguments neared their end, the courtroom felt sealed inside a reality built on manipulation. I wasn't just fighting for custody anymore. I was fighting against a version of myself that had been carefully constructed to be judged and condemned. And as the judge nodded along, taking notes, I realized how dangerous a well-told lie could be when it was given the authority of law. Throughout the hearing, my daughter remained almost invisible to everyone else in the room, tucked quietly behind the rows of polished benches where adults argued over her future as though she weren't there at all. To the court, she was a name on documents, a subject of schedules and percentages, but to me, she was the steady presence I could feel even without turning around. While lawyers spoke and papers were shuffled, she watched, absorbing every word, every shift in tone, every glance exchanged across the room. There was a seriousness in her posture that felt far beyond her years, as if she understood that something fragile was being decided without her voice. I caught brief glimpses of her when the tension became too heavy to bear. She wasn't crying, she wasn't fidgeting or seeking comfort. Instead, her eyes moved carefully from speaker to speaker, taking in the performance unfolding before her. That calm unsettled me more than tears would have. It suggested awareness, a quiet processing of truths that the adults in the room were either ignoring or deliberately hiding. I wondered what conclusions she was drawing, what memories were being etched into her mind as she listened to people describe her father in ways she knew were incomplete. Children hear more than we think. They remember details adults dismiss as insignificant. I realized then that she had lived through the moments being debated in abstract terms. She remembered who helped with homework when her mother worked late, who sat beside her during fevers, who listened when she was scared to sleep alone. While the courtroom focused on documents and testimony, my daughter held a private archive of lived experiences, unfiltered and unedited. No lawyer had asked her to speak, and no one seemed to notice the quiet authority of her presence. As the hearing progressed, I sensed a shift in her demeanor. What began as observation slowly turned to resolve. Her hands, once folded neatly in her lap, tightened slightly around something I couldn't see. At the time, I thought it was just nerves, a child's way of coping with stress. I had no idea that she was preparing herself, weighing a decision no one had asked her to make. In a room where adults wielded words like weapons, she was choosing silence, not out of fear, but out of patience. That realization filled me with a strange mix of guilt and pride. Guilt that she had been forced into this position, watching her parents dismantle each other under fluorescent lights. Pride that she possessed a strength I hadn't recognized before, a quiet courage that didn't demand attention. She wasn't trying to take sides. She was holding on to the truth, safeguarding it, until the moment felt right. When I looked back at her one last time before the recess was called, our eyes met briefly. There was no panic in her gaze, only a calm certainty that caught me off guard. In that instant, I understood that while I felt powerless at the table, I was not alone. The smallest person in the room had seen everything, remembered everything, and was ready, whether I knew it or not, to protect the truth we shared. The moment came suddenly, almost without warning, and yet it had been quietly building in the background the entire time.
After hours of arguments, testimony, and a near-constant hum of tension, the judge called for a brief recess. People shuffled in the small courtroom, some stepping into hallways, others whispering quietly. I slumped back in my chair, the weight of hopelessness pressing down on me, convinced that the battle had already been lost. That's when I noticed my daughter, still seated quietly, reaching into her small bag. At first, I thought she was just holding on to her notebook or maybe a snack she had brought. Then, with deliberate calm, she pulled out her phone. My stomach sank. I worried she might be trying to do something that would get her in trouble, unaware of the rules or the gravity of the moment. But then she pressed play, and a screen flickered to life for everyone to see. The courtroom went silent. I could feel it before I even looked up, a sudden shift in the air. The polished veneer of authority, the confident voices, and the rehearsed accusations seemed to falter under the weight of what was unfolding. On the screen were moments I had long feared could never be proved. My daughter laughing as I helped her with late-night homework, snippets of conversations that clearly contradicted the narrative being presented by the other side, and, most importantly, evidence of care, presence, and love that could not be ignored or spun into something negative. Every clip was a quiet but undeniable declaration of truth, a counterpoint to the courtroom's carefully constructed story. I could see the expressions of the attorneys change first. Their composure faltered. They whispered to each other, glancing at the judge with eyes that betrayed uncertainty. The judge himself leaned forward, his pen pausing mid-note, his brow furrowing in recognition that he was seeing something that had been previously hidden from the official record. Even my wife's face changed. Her carefully curated confidence wavered as she realized that the narrative she had built so meticulously was being dismantled, not with arguments or motions, but by undeniable living proof of a reality she could not contest. There was a strange power in that video. It was not explosive, loud, or confrontational. It did not scream accusations or demand attention. Instead, it revealed truth quietly, insistently, and in a way that demanded recognition. Every silent moment on that screen carried more weight than the hours of debate that had come before. It was a reminder that the smallest gestures, the overlooked moments, and the memories preserved in the heart of a child could carry a power far greater than any legal strategy. As the video played, I felt a mixture of relief, awe, and disbelief. Relief that the truth was finally visible to everyone, awe at my daughter's courage and foresight, and disbelief that it had taken this long for the reality of our lives to break through the barriers of courtroom theatrics. In that frozen moment, as the entire room absorbed what they were seeing, I understood that justice had not come from argument alone, but from honesty, memory, and the unwavering bond between a father and his child. The aftermath of the video's revelation was unlike anything I could have anticipated. What had begun as a courtroom weighed down by tension, frustration, and the looming certainty of defeat suddenly shifted into a space where silence spoke louder than any argument. The judge, who had spent the majority of the hearing nodding along politely yet critically, leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the screen one more time before slowly lowering them to meet mine. In that brief exchange, I could see a recognition that went far beyond the legal points being debated. It was a recognition of truth, of presence, of consistent care that no document or testimony could fully capture. That truth had been carried into the room by my daughter, the one person whose voice had been overlooked until this moment. For a few heart-stopping seconds, the courtroom felt frozen. The attorneys were momentarily silent, unsure of how to respond to something so undeniable. My wife, whose confidence had dominated the proceedings for hours, now appeared uncertain and vulnerable. The careful construction of her narrative had crumbled, not through strategy or skill, but through honesty revealed in living, breathing moments. It was in these subtle gestures, the laughter, the patient explanations, the quiet nights spent together, that the story of our lives became undeniable. What had been missing from every legal argument, every exhibit, every meticulously framed accusation was the reality of the bond that had sustained us through years of challenges. In the following minutes, as the judge called the proceedings back to order, there was a palpable shift. Questions were framed differently now, tones softened, and the focus began to return to the actual well-being of my daughter. It was no longer a contest of words alone. It had become a matter of justice grounded in truth. The ruling that followed reflected this change. Custody and visitation arrangements were reevaluated, not merely in terms of technicalities or selective interpretations, but with an acknowledgement of the consistent love and care I had provided. What had seemed impossible only moments before had become attainable through the courage of the one person who had understood the stakes most clearly, my daughter. Beyond the courtroom, there was a profound sense of redemption. This was not just about legal vindication or the restoration of parental rights. It was about reclaiming the narrative of our lives, restoring dignity where it had been challenged, and ensuring that the truth of our relationship was recognized by those who had sought to obscure it. In the weeks that followed, our bond grew stronger, fortified by the shared experience of standing together in the face of adversity. The ordeal reinforced a lesson I had always hoped to impart, but had never needed to see so dramatically demonstrated: that honesty, courage, and integrity carry a power that no legal strategy or deceitful argument can overcome. Most importantly, the experience left an indelible mark on my daughter. She had been the quiet observer, the keeper of truth, and ultimately the catalyst for change. Watching her navigate that moment with clarity and composure revealed a depth of character beyond her years. Our unbreakable bond, tested under immense pressure, had emerged not only intact, but strengthened. It became clear that true justice is not always about the letter of the law, but about the recognition of real human connection, the acknowledgement of love and consistency, and the courage to stand for what is right, even when the world seems set against you. In that frozen courtroom and in the life that followed, we had both found a form of justice that was far more meaningful than any ruling alone could ever convey.